Welcome back, everyone. In today's video, let's start with a small detail, a line of news almost lost in the smoke and fire of the Middle East, but one that could shift the entire global balance. On June 25, 2025, while the world's attention was locked on the Israel-Iran-US conflict, a quiet update appeared on the official BRICS website. Vietnam had officially become a new partner of the bloc. No live summit, no grand declarations, no photos of handshakes, just a cold press release, yet behind it lies a strategic turning point. It was an event that seemed long in the making. Back in October 2024, at the BRICS summit held in Kazan, Russia, Vietnam was invited to join as a partner. But unlike other countries like Thailand, Malaysia, or Kazakhstan, who rushed to confirm their participation in early 2025, Vietnam chose silence. No rejection, no agreement, just waiting. For half a year, Hanoi made no official announcement. And then, right when the world was busy with headlines about airstrikes, oil, nukes, and the Gulf, a subtle move from Vietnam caught geopolitical observers off guard. Vietnam had joined BRICS on its own terms. This was the choice of a nation that knows exactly where it stands on the world map. Not a superpower, but unwilling to be a satellite, neither fully leaning toward the US, nor letting China pull it too close. A consistent foreign policy based on the principles of independence, self-reliance, equal cooperation, not on military might or confrontational statements. In a time when major power blocs like NATO and the G7 are becoming increasingly closed off and inward-looking, Vietnam's decision to join BRICS wasn't just an economic move, it was a clear political message. Vietnam wants to help build a new world order, fairer, more multipolar, and less dominated by might makes right thinking. It was a quiet move, but a razor-sharp one, because Vietnam is not alone. Over the past 2 years, BRICS has steadily expanded, welcoming countries from Africa, Asia, and South America. A new network is taking shape, where the voices of developing nations carry more weight, and where Vietnam is no longer an exception. And to understand why this choice matters so much, we need to take a closer look at BRICS itself, the power bloc quietly reshaping the global order. A bloc that's no longer just a symbol of emerging economies, but a true global counterweight. We'll continue in part 2, BRICS 20, the new power bloc of the world. BRICS was originally just a financial term coined by Goldman Sachs in 2001 to refer to a group of emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. But more than 2 decades later, what started as a theoretical concept has transformed into a tangible political and economic entity with growing influence over the global order. And especially since 2024, when BRICS expanded to include 20 member and partner countries, the bloc has truly emerged as a new global power center. BRICS 20 isn't just massive in terms of population, boasting over 4.45 billion people, more than half of the world's population. It also accounts for 44% of global GDP when measured by purchasing power parity. These numbers are no longer just potential. They are real power. From energy, technology, agriculture, and finance to cross-border payment systems, BRICS is steadily building its own infrastructure, independent of the US dollar and free from Western institutions' control. Vietnam didn't join BRICS to be a second-tier player. As the tech manufacturing hub of Southeast Asia and an essential link in the global supply chain, Vietnam brings something to the table that many current BRICS members still lack: deep connections to US and European markets, as well as access to advanced multilateral trade agreements. That's why Vietnam's entry is being seen by experts as strategic. It not only strengthens BRICS's foothold in Southeast Asia, a region often seen as a strategic battleground between the US and China, but also helps diversify the bloc's internal structure. Instead of being steered solely by major powers like China or Russia, BRICS is increasingly taking on the shape of a multi-centered model, where mid-sized countries with long-term vision like Vietnam play a pivotal role. Moreover, the expansion of BRICS sends a clear message to the Western world. Developing nations are no longer willing to accept a passive role. They are no longer sitting on the sidelines of global affairs. They're actively shaping a new rulebook, one built on equality, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation. But as Vietnam takes its seat at the BRICS table, pressure from external powers begins to mount, especially from the United States, which has long seen Vietnam as a critical piece in its strategy to contain China. And it's no coincidence that just a few months before Vietnam's BRICS announcement, Washington launched a heavy blow aimed directly at the heart of Vietnam's economy. This wasn't just about tariffs. It was a clear message. It's time for Vietnam to choose a side. To understand this turning point more deeply, we'll continue in Part 3, America and the Strategy to Force Vietnam's Hand. Since 2016, when the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific became the cornerstone of U.S. strategic policy, Vietnam was immediately placed at the center of nearly every Washington document on the region. Not because of a large military, but because Hanoi sits right next to China, boasts a long coastline, strategic deep water ports, and a rapidly rising, confident economy. In America's eyes, this was the ideal partner to help counter Beijing, if it could be brought into its orbit. For years, the U.S. steadily deepened its ties with Vietnam across defense, trade, and technology transfer. Phrases like comprehensive strategic partnership, friendshoring, and trusted supply chains echoed throughout high-level visits. Major corporations like Apple, Intel, and Google poured billions of dollars into high-tech zones in Bac Ninh, Da Nang, and Ho Chi Minh City. But behind the surface of cooperation was mounting geopolitical pressure. Under President Donald Trump's second term, diplomacy took on a much sharper edge. Gone were the softer gestures. In their place, hardline statements, high-stakes bilateral negotiations, and most notably, a heavy blow in early April 2025. The U.S. imposed tariffs of up to 46% on many of Vietnam's key exports, including wood products, electronics, and textiles. No prior warning. No bilateral dialogue. Just a single statement from the U.S. Trade Representative's office, citing violations of origin rules and supply chain imbalances. For Vietnam, this was an unofficial but calculated act of economic warfare. It didn't just threaten tens of billions in export revenue. It sent a cold political message: either align fully with the U.S. or be punished as a country abusing trade. However, instead of scrambling to appease Washington or rushing into concessions, Vietnam took a different path, joining BRICS. It was a wise move, not a direct challenge to the U.S., but also a refusal to be coerced. It was a quiet assertion: Vietnam will cooperate with all sides, but it will not be anyone's pawn. And while the U.S. tried to force Vietnam to choose a side, China approached from another angle: softer, more flexible, but no less strategic. The Vietnam-China relationship is a paradox, deeply interdependent yet marked by distrust, cooperative yet cautious. It's precisely this complexity that has pushed Vietnam to maintain a delicate balance, never tilting too far in either direction. We'll continue in Part 4, Vietnam and China, Cooperation with Caution. As U.S.-Vietnam relations grew strained over punitive tariffs, China seized the opportunity to tighten its cooperation with Vietnam. Just 1 month after the U.S. announced the 46% tariff hike, President Xi Jinping made an official visit to Hanoi, the most symbolically significant trip in years of South China Sea tensions. The two sides signed 45 cooperation agreements spanning infrastructure, logistics, digital transformation, clean energy, and even plans for a north-south high-speed railway. It was a highly calculated move by Beijing. With China under increasing pressure from the U.S. in areas ranging from technology and finance to supply chain strategy, pulling Vietnam closer had become a matter of strategic survival. Vietnam isn't just geographically vital, it's also becoming a new transit hub for multinational corporations. If China could establish a soft connection with Vietnam, it might retain some influence in a region that is gradually leaning toward the West. But Vietnam, as always, is not an easy piece to maneuver. Its thousand-year history of resistance against Northern domination has built a deep national consciousness of caution. The relationship between the two countries is inherently dualistic, a need for economic cooperation paired with a persistent wariness of hegemonic ambitions. That's why, in all cooperation agreements, Vietnam strictly upholds its four no's principle: no military alliances, no aligning with one country against another, no foreign military bases on Vietnamese soil, and no use of force in international relations. These are not just diplomatic guidelines, they are the fortress walls that safeguard national sovereignty. Even in cooperating with China, Vietnam proactively seeks counterbalances. Connectivity projects with Japan, South Korea, India, and the European Union are actively pursued in parallel. In defense, Vietnam continues diversifying its arms sources from Russia to Israel, France, and India. In media and academia, sensitive topics like the South China Sea and national sovereignty are still strongly emphasized through official channels and scholarly discourse. But perhaps what truly sets Vietnam apart isn't simply who it partners with, but how it chooses to develop. Vietnam has not copied China's model, nor mimicked the West. Instead, it has charted its own course, what it calls a socialist-oriented market economy, a model shaped by lived experience, tested through challenges, and grounded in a deep aspiration for autonomy. And it's precisely this model that caught BRICS' attention, prompting the invitation for Vietnam to join as a partner. When BRICS leaders discussed expanding the bloc in late 2024, Vietnam quickly stood out as a strategic choice, not just because of its geographic location or its role in global supply chains, but also because of its distinct development model, one that blends socialist ideals with dynamic engagement in the global market economy. Since the Doi Moi reforms in 1986, Vietnam has gradually moved away from a centrally planned economy toward an open, market-based one, but not a laissez-faire model. The state continues to play a guiding role in key sectors like banking, energy, and telecommunications, while tightly regulating the operations of state-owned enterprises. At the same time, the private sector and foreign direct investment, FDI, have been strongly encouraged to thrive. This has created a dual structure in which market forces and state leadership don't cancel each other out. They complement one another. This is what Vietnam calls a socialist-oriented market economy. It's not just a slogan, it's a flexible system designed to optimize growth while maintaining social equity. Vietnam has achieved what few developing countries have managed: sustained GDP growth for over 3 decades, a sharp reduction in poverty, a growing middle class, and most importantly, economic progress without sacrificing social stability. In 1990, Vietnam's per capita GDP was lower than Haiti's, but by 2025, the average Vietnamese earns about $14 to $15 per day, higher than in India or the Philippines, and nearing parity with China. This economic growth has led to clear improvements in healthcare, education, infrastructure, and life expectancy. Vietnam is also one of the few developing countries to maintain a relatively low Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality, compared to others in the region. It's this success story that has captured the attention of many BRICS countries, especially in Africa and South America. These nations don't want to replicate China's model, but they also find Western paths unsuitable for their realities. Vietnam, with its pragmatic and balanced approach, is emerging as a viable alternative, a country that doesn't rely on vast natural resources, doesn't need to embrace chaotic democratic transitions, yet still manages to rise steadily and sustainably. However, economic success cannot be separated from political stability, and that's where the biggest question arises, especially from Western media. Vietnam is growing fast, but is it democratic? A country without multi-party elections, without press freedom as defined by the West, can it be called democratic? The answer, as felt by many Vietnamese people, doesn't lie in political theory. It lies in the lived reality of everyday life. In the eyes of many Western institutions, Vietnam is often ranked low on democracy indexes. Reports from the Economist Intelligence Unit or Freedom House regularly label Vietnam with terms like authoritarian regime, no press freedom, and no multi-party elections. But there's one thing these assessments often overlook: the lived experience of the Vietnamese people, the ones who navigate this system every day. According to the annual survey by the Alliance of Democracies, an independent organization based in Europe, Vietnam consistently ranks among the countries with the highest levels of satisfaction with their government. Nearly 80% of surveyed Vietnamese believe they are living in a democratic nation, where the government represents the common interest, listens to the people, and maintains the stability needed for growth. In Vietnam, democracy doesn't mean multi-party elections or fiery debates on televised panels. Democracy means access to affordable healthcare, free education for children, steadily improving infrastructure year after year, and effective social welfare programs for the poorest citizens. It is democracy in action, not just on paper. Vietnam doesn't claim to be a perfect model, But the way the country has managed to maintain political stability while opening widely to market economics, defending its sovereignty, and preserving its cultural identity has given many developing nations something to reflect on. Not every country needs a version of democracy modeled after the US or Europe. What matters more is whether people feel represented, heard, and able to live in a fair society, regardless of what the system is called. And it's from that very foundation that Vietnam steps into international platforms like BRICS with confidence. Not to imitate, not to prove anything, but to present an alternative approach. Growth with stability, reform under control, and democracy adapted to its own cultural and historical realities. However, joining BRICS also means Vietnam must reassess its position in the region. ASEAN, the bloc Vietnam has been a part of for more than 3 decades, remains a critical pillar of Southeast Asian stability. Will expanding global influence through BRICS pull Vietnam away from ASEAN, or will it open a new strategic chapter, where Vietnam becomes a bridge between the region and the world? When Vietnam joined BRICS as a partner in June 2025, many regional experts feared that this move might overshadow the country's traditional role within ASEAN, a bloc Hanoi has long regarded as the cornerstone of regional stability. But in reality, the opposite has proven true. Rather than abandoning one to pursue the other, Vietnam is demonstrating its ability to play on 2 boards at once, the regional and the global. BRICS and ASEAN are not in competition. They are complementary. ASEAN provides a space for peace, cooperation, and intra-regional connectivity. BRICS, on the other hand, opens the door for developing nations to step beyond their continental boundaries into bigger arenas of finance, technology, and global order restructuring. Vietnam's presence in both is not a contradiction, but an evolution of a flexible and deliberate multilateral diplomacy strategy. Within BRICS, Vietnam stands alongside rapidly emerging economies like India, Brazil, South Africa, and nations from the Gulf and Africa. It's a platform for Vietnam to exchange development models, access alternative financial mechanisms, and forge new strategic alliances free from the standards imposed by Western-led systems. Meanwhile, in ASEAN, Vietnam continues to be a strong, independent voice, shaping joint statements on maritime security, regional trade, and crisis response. In recent years, as some ASEAN members have grown overly dependent on China or become entangled in internal disputes, Vietnam has emerged as a stabilizing pillar, a quiet strategist balancing the playing field. From a strategic standpoint, having a foot in both BRICS and ASEAN allows Vietnam to position itself as a bridge between geopolitical spheres, linking developing nations with one another and connecting Southeast Asia to the wider world. Few countries, especially of Vietnam's mid-sized scale, have managed to walk this line. In an age where superpowers are increasingly confrontational and polarizing, the role of middle powers, non-aligned but with a clear and confident voice, is becoming more crucial. And Vietnam, with its steady but deliberate approach, is emerging as a model of resilience, diplomacy, and long-term vision. But more importantly, Vietnam isn't doing this to become a third world hero. It's doing it because it understands the world is undergoing profound change. A world where the West is no longer the sole center of gravity. A world where the old order is cracking and a new one is being rewritten day by day, not through force, but through models, through choices, and through identity. This is the post-Western world. There's something unfolding quietly, but irreversibly. The world is entering a post-Western era. No longer is it a time when Washington, London, or Brussels get to define the rules of the global game. Today, nations once considered peripheral, like Vietnam, are beginning to reshape the center of the New World Order, not through military power, but through adaptability, through practical development models, and through the courage to remain independent amidst geopolitical cross-currents. Vietnam's entry into BRICS wasn't a political parade, it was an unspoken declaration that Vietnam no longer wants to be the one caught in the middle, pulled between power blocks, but the one who steps onto the board with its own values, its own vision, and its own approach. In this post-Western world, fractured by war, extreme nationalism, and crises of trust, the voice of nations that choose not to pick sides but choose principles is more vital than ever. Vietnam is not anti-America, nor is it chasing after China. Vietnam is walking its own path, a path that isn't easy, filled with challenges, but deeply rooted in its history of self-defense, its ambition for sustainable growth, and its determination never to let others write its future. That choice doesn't need to be loud, it only needs to be consistent. In BRICS, Vietnam is not just a learner, it is a contributor, not just a participant, but a shaper. Other nations are looking to Vietnam for inspiration because not everyone wants to copy the Chinese model, and not everyone has the means to meet Western benchmarks. In that space in between, Vietnam, with its experience of war, poverty, reform, pandemic control, and economic recovery, has become a source of moral grounding for a fragmented world. The post-Western world is not a rupture, it's an invitation for once silent nations to find their voice, for once overlooked nations to begin setting their own standards. And Vietnam, a country that rose from the ashes of war, is becoming one of the first voices to speak out, strong and full of confidence. If today's story resonated with you, don't forget to leave a comment below. What do you think is Vietnam's most fitting role in this emerging world order? And hit subscribe to continue with us on this journey, telling the quiet shifts that are, little by little, changing the world. See you in the next story.